Hello there, welcome to my channel. My name is Doug and I'm back with another Pen Resurrection Sunday video. Usually I start these resurrection videos with a triage of the pen that's on the slab for today, but I know that this pen requires some special nib attention. So before I even look at what else the pen needs, I'm going to take a look at this nib and do a dip test and see what I'm in for on this one, to see whether I can actually complete this one in my timeline. This is a let's get it right, I got the last one wrong. This is a 1936, second quarter of 1936 Parker Vacumatic in golden pearl. It's a debutante, and the first one in this series I did last week, and that was this 1940 Parker Vacumatic in burgundy pearl, and it is a debutante size as well. Here is my favorite vintage pen, my 1945 Parker Vacumatic. This is a Generation 3 Vacumatic in azure pearl, and this is a normal size Vacumatic, so you can see what the difference is between a regular size and the debutante size. And this pen sold even before the video went live to the public, because members get early bird views of the Pen Resurrection videos, and one of our members saw that early. Well, it was like I think it was a week early, perhaps. One of my members saw the pen and fell in love with it, and this is going out, today's Sunday, it's going out tomorrow morning to the new owner. Beautiful, beautiful pen, writes wonderfully, and I'm hoping to have the same results with this one. Even though this one, the Vacumatic diaphragm is intact, and the translucency is excellent on this, so we can actually see the diaphragm in there. My concern is with the nib, and I'm not sure that I can see this on camera. Maybe you can. I don't know whether you can see that or not. But the nib is a bit splayed, a bit sprung. The way I like to describe this is through diagrams. So if this is looking end on to a tip of a normal nib, both sides of the nib need to align like that. And this one kind of looks like this right now, because the nib has been bent outwards, not just split apart, but opened up top to bottom. So we have to rotate these nib tines back in again and then get them closed. So that's what I have to do to this nib. But I thought before I even try to repair this pen, I'd do a dip test to see whether it writes, because sometimes a nib might look really horrible, but it writes just fine. I don't expect that here because of the way that nib is shaped right now. But let's find out what we're dealing with. So this is a 1936, wow, Parker Vacumatic in golden pearl. And you can hear that. Maybe you can hear that. Let's put the mic right there. Very scratchy that way. Not too bad. Rough that way and that way, but certainly side to side it is awful. Yeah, and that's because these edges here are very sharp and they're digging into the page. So I've got this new tool from Pen Tooling. Here it is here. You can see it was $45 US, and it is a nib tool. You can use the end of that very sharp pliers blade to grip the nib in very small places and twist it this way and twist it that way. So I think what I want to do is open this pen up, knock out the feed and the nib, put the nib on my nib block to make sure it's nice and smooth and there's no wobbles and waves in it, and straight, and then work on it with my new nib tool to get those tines aligned so they're straight up and down, and then with the tip of the nib get it so that there's no gap in there. So move those tines together. So straighten it up and then bring them together. And then once it's aligned and straight and everything, then we can deal with any smoothness issues we might have with micromesh. That's the key here, is that you've got to get your nib aligned perfectly first before you apply any polishing, any micro mesh to smooth the nib. Because if you smooth it when it's like this, you're going to get all kinds of flow issues because it's going to round those inner corners off the nib. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to get this nib out of here. I'll soak all the bits in pen flush. Let's see whether this comes. Yep. So this unscrews. I have had it unscrewed before, but it did actually come apart very easily. There's the nib unit with the breather tube and the feed. And so let's put that in the block and knock it out. So here we are on the bill with Matt and Doug's block. Sorry, we're here on the mat with Doug and Bill's block. Thank you, Bill. We're going to remove this breather tube very carefully. It usually just twists out. Maybe it needs some soaking. There we go. It's just a hollow plastic tube. But what I learned from last week's resurrection was that when you put this back in again, it's possible to put it in way too far. And I'll show you where the blowhole is on the feed when I knock this feed out of here, and why that breather tube blocked that blowhole and I got no fill on that burgundy Debutante. So we'll put that breather tube aside. We'll find the right hole for our section. Get out Doug's small hammer, gain some height, and then we'll tap this feed out of here. So that's the feed gone, and there is the nib. Pull it out, and there is our feed. I'll put this in the ultrasonic bath of pen flush, which is 90% distilled water and 10% ammonia. And I promised to show you my blowhole. Yeah, no, this is not X-rated. This is pen related. And there is the blowhole right there. And so when the breather tube goes in here, ink flows between that part there through this hole and through the breather tube. What I did on the last resurrection was I put that breather tube in there and pushed it in so far that it actually blocked that blowhole. So don't block your blowhole.
Ow! You shot me, you a-hole!
Is the advice for today's resurrection. Now, the point of this is to get that nib back into shape. So I'm going to put it on my nib block. It's a little piece of acrylic that is concave shaped on one side and convex shaped on the other. And I put a couple of pieces of double-sided carpet tape on there just to hold the nib wherever I put it on there. I use this small roller to make sure that nib is nice and flat. Turn it over and put it in the concave side and use a small spudger, plastic spudger, to flatten it out that way. It does look like there are a couple of waffles in there, little wobbles from where this pen must have been dropped. To make it splay like that, it must have been dropped. So first thing, I'm going to get my new pliers at it and try to get those tines so that they face each other properly. And that's a very, very delicate process, so I'm going to do that off camera with my magnifying lenses on. So pardon the microphone here. I'm back on my iPhone mic, but I wanted to show you in progress what I've been doing. I've got a spark plug gapping tool here that I use for shimming, because I've got various thicknesses. This is 0.005 inches or 0.127 millimeters, and I've got it down the slit of that nib, and I'm using my plastic spudger here to press down on that metal. And the idea is to get them flat. I used my USB microscope to show you what the splay is on those tines right now before I started this process, and hopefully I'll be able to show you the microscope of it much better. But this is in progress, and it seems to be working. If I press each tine individually against that flat metal surface, it might bring them together so that they're symmetrical with each other and aligned. And then I can deal with the gap afterwards, because this is making quite a gap in that slot. Let's see if I can get a little bit closer here without getting too pixelated, so you can see the idea here. You can see there's a little bit of a gap right there, and a little bit of a gap there, not so much, but this one, it needs a little bit of work. So I'm pressing down on it here with my spudger, with my plastic spudger. And the idea is to not snap off that tipping material, because this is old and brittle, and I've had that experience before where the tipping material just snaps right off. So we'll see how it goes, and we'll see if I make any progress. And no sooner did I say that, and that's exactly what happened. It snapped off. And there's the little speck. That little speck right there is what came off that nib. So this is bound for Stubville. So I'm going to try to do that process whereby I'll cut the tines off right about there, and that'll get us about a 0.8 millimeter stub, something like that. I don't want it to be too thick, but if we start small, we have somewhere to go. So we can grind it bigger if we need to. But I'm going to clip that off, and we'll see whether we can make this pen right. Okay, so there. I cut it off square, and I think I got past all the little waffly bits. We'll make sure it's fully aligned, and then I'm going to grind it down into a stub, a smooth stub, and hopefully will write as beautifully as this one. This is my 1945 Parker Azure Pearl Vacumatic that had the same thing. The tine snapped off the tipping material, and I ground it down into that stub. So maybe you can see there what that shape looks like all the way around. I start with sandpaper, about 400 grit to get that shape, and then go through the micromesh one by one from 1500 through to 12,000. Writing as I go to make sure that it's still working. But we have to align this nib first to make sure that it's fully aligned properly. It looks like it's got a little bit of a wow in it right there. So I want to straighten that out, and we'll clean up the nib, and then we'll go to town on grinding a stub out of a 1936 gold nib from Parker. Wow. Knocking off the corners. So the raw block right there, knocked off all the corners, smoothed the face. Now we're going to put the angle on it that we want to write with, and I think I might just put this in the section with the feed and the breather tube and everything, and dip test it, grind it from there, because once it's on the feed, the nib shapes to the feed, and I want to make sure that I don't grind the nib and then put it on the feed and it's all wonky. So we're going to put it back together again and see whether we can shape it in the section. So this is where we are now. I've put the nib and the feed back into the section. The nib is in rough italic shape, so that's a rough italic. Let's measure it now while I got my calipers out here and see what we get. It's about a 0.9 millimeter at this point, and I dipped it. There's the horizontal line, and there's the vertical line. Let me get my Richard Binder chart out and see what we have here. It looks like, yeah, it looks like a 0.08 millimeter stub at this point. It's not even a stub, it's an italic, and a rough one at that, because none of those edges are smoothed out. You saw them, they're just as rough as they were when I cut it, and I just smoothed the edges with some 400 grit. There actually is no angled surface on there right now. So this nib looks like this, basically from side on, it looks like that, and from top view, it looks like that, and from front view, it looks like that. And I've just knocked the corners off a little bit all the way around like that. I've knocked those corners off. Now for the front edge, again, side view here, it looks like that. What I want to do is cut it on a bit of an angle that matches my angle to the page. So I'm going to draw it across my 400 grit down, 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 and get that chamfer on that edge, and so it'll sort of be a chisel point. And then I'll start knocking off some of those edges a little bit, and then check to see how it writes. It'll be very, very rough, but if it's making lines, and even though it's rough, it's making lines, then I can smooth it out with some micro mesh. I run the nib down in down strokes, sort of matching my writing angle, and then just sort of knocked off some corners all the way around very lightly. And this is how it's writing right now. Not too bad. Of course, it's watery right now because I've been using water on the sandpaper. But I think I'm going to start on the micro mesh now and try to polish that out. Let's see if we can get a close-up view of that nib, the way I've cut it off and ground it. And you might be able to see that small rounded angle on the bottom that I've made, and I've knocked all the corners off. The front edge still has some rough bits, but we don't write with the front edge. I'll polish that a little bit as we go through the micro mesh, and the top edge as well. It's actually writing on the top edge. So we'll go through the micro mesh and see what we come up with. Okay, so I've gone through the entire micro mesh, polishing through from 1500 grit to 12,000 grit. It's writing very, very smoothly. I kept dipping this pen in the ink to dip test it while I'm grinding it. And then I thought, why do I keep doing that? This already has a diaphragm that works in it. We might as well just fill up the pen. So I went ahead and filled up the pen. I kept pumping it, and I got no ink whatsoever. And then I looked at my little keeper here and noticed that I didn't put the breather tube back in. So I went ahead and stuck that breather tube back in and pumped it up full of ink, and did the rest of the grinding of this nib. Now this nib is very wet and very smooth. And horizontally, we are getting a little bit thicker than it was before I started grinding it. And vertically, it kind of varies with the angle, but it's still about 0.8. So I think we're getting 0.8 to about, 0.2 millimeters? I'll measure these thin lines and find out. But now that I know it writes, I've had my trials and tribulations with this nib, snapping it as you saw, and then grinding it into a stub. It's writing just as nicely, maybe even a little wetter than my 1945 Parker Vacumatic in Azure Pearl. So now what I want to do is go through and do the surface restoration. Let's take a look at what this pen needs. You can see that there's some divots on that section right there. So some dents there and some scratches. The barrel has micro scratches all over it. You can see the imprint right here. It says 0.26 point. I don't know whether this was a transition for their markings for quarters, but the 2 dots mean the second quarter, and I guess the 2 means the second quarter as well. But that 6 means 1936. So this lockdown filler was not made until 1933, so it could be 1926, and it was not made after about 1939, I'm guessing, something around there. They started transitioning to the speed line. I think I've got a speed line to show you. Hang on a sec. Here's a Parker Duofold from 1940, and it has the speed line filler on it, so you can see the difference. The shorter blind cap on the lockdown and the longer blind cap, because this doesn't lock down anymore. They just allowed it to extend, and they put a longer blind cap on it like that. So, and that happened in about 1939, 1940. And then this speed line went away as soon as the war started in 1941, and they went to, let's look at all of them, Doug. Why not? Visual aids. So let's go in order here. I have to juggle them. Juggling the pens. Here we go. So this was first 1933 to about 1939, 1938, something like that. There was a transition from the lockdown filler to the speedline filler and the longer blind cap. And then starting with the war, they went away from that to the third generation pump filler, only it was not brass like this. This is a modern recreation of that pump filler, Vacumatic filler. that I got from Pen Tooling. But this on the original was made of celluloid, and they wanted to reduce the amount of metals that they were using in their pens because of the war effort. So there you go, Generation 1, Generation 2, and Generation 3. And this 1940 Parker Duofold is for sale. Take a look on my Wix channel to see this pen for sale. It's a beautiful striped celluloid. But let's continue on with the triage of this pen. Lots of micro scratches. The blind cap has some gouges. The end finial in the same gold pearl stacked celluloid is looking lovely. There's some dents and divots on that gold bezel. The filler itself is stiff and doesn't move very well, so I've lubricated it and it's much better. Now let's look at the cap. Lots of gouges and abrasions all through that cap. The clip is in really good shape. The top finial even is very, very nice, but could stand a polish. So we're going to take all these bits apart, and I'm going to sand down those divots first with some 400 grit and go over the entire pen with 400 grit to get out those micro abrasions. And then we'll polish up through the micro mesh and get this thing looking like brand new. Now we're going to see about removing that clip and that top jewel on the top finial and the jewel on the bottom finial and that little bezel right there. I've loosened these up already. I use a little bit of matte and some low tack painter's tape, and I put a pencil with the eraser on the inside to give me some support, and I use a bit of card here under the clip so that it doesn't further scratch that celluloid. And then I give the whole thing a push and give it a turn and let that clip rotate. And that's coming out now. There's the top jewel, and there is the brass insert. This one's interesting in that usually they have a slot on it, so you can take it out. Oh, this one doesn't have a slot. Might have to use the masking tape on it. Again, it doesn't want to move. Well, that's interesting. I'll have to think about that, whether I want to score some slots in there to get it out with a slot screwdriver or not, whether it's worth it. I'll have to give that some thought. Now, this end piece here, I put the eraser right in there like that and give it a turn with the masking tape, and it should come off. There we go. And the bezel with it. Now I can put this back on the body, and that has some slots in it. See, they've chiseled some slots in that aluminum. I might have to do that with that piece of brass. And these are two different size jewels, so one won't fit the other and vice versa. So we keep these in a safe space, because I'll want to polish them as well, and keep this little part. And I'm keeping the two little tips as well. If I sell this pen, I can sell those little tips for like 10 bucks. What do you think? $5 a tip? And he's a big tipper. And now I'm just going to open that section up, dump out the ink I put in there, and clean it out. I'm not going to take that nib out of there because I've got this nib writing well now and I don't want to ruin it, but I will rinse it out, and I'll put that section back in the barrel so I can polish the whole thing as one piece. Okay, I got that brass nut out of there by putting some needle nose pliers on the inside and just sort of holding them open a little bit and dragging it around. It was loose enough that I was able to get it out. The thing is, I needed to get it back in again. So I took my Dremel tool and I sort of notched a couple of notches in there that I can put my slot screwdriver in and get it back in again. So now I have the cap by itself, and there is our clip. So these parts are going in the ultrasonic bath of pen flush, and then I'll go after this cap to start with some 400 grit sandpaper. So here's the cap and the barrel and the section sanded with 400 grit, avoiding the imprint. I've got most of the gouges out. There is quite a few teeth marks in this blind cap. So now I'm going to go through the micro mesh from 1500 through to 12,000, and then add in some polishing compound, and we'll get this thing sparkling again like new. When I do all that, I'm going to add in the little celluloid jewels and polish them up at the same time, and then we'll put all this hardware back on again. The clip came out very, very nicely, and I've polished that up with some metal polish and with some buffing on the jewelry cloth, and so it's looking very, very good indeed. So here's the barrel all polished up and the section, and I've got the jewel on the end, and I have a little story to tell you about this bit. Remember I tell you about these little plastic containers that keep all your small bits so you don't lose them, because the small bits, some of them can't be replaced. Like that little small bit right there. I was putting this jewel and gold bezel back on, and I decided to polish up the gold piece first. So I took both of these pieces out of my little cup and put the jewel down there, and then was working on this, polishing it up with my jewel cloth, and then I go to put the jewel back in, and it's not there. I mean, it was literally seconds. I polished this up, and then I put the jewel down, and I went to go grab it, and it was gone.
I got a $100 check from my grandma, and my dad said I need to put it in the bank so it can grow over the years.
Well, that's fantastic. We can put that check in a money market mutual fund, and it's gone.
What?
It's gone. It's all gone.
What do you mean? I have $100.
Not anymore, you don't. Poof.
I tore my entire desk apart, and it took about 15-20 minutes and a lot of cursing. Then I started searching on my hands and knees on the floor, and there it was, sitting on the floor between my legs. Tiny little piece of celluloid on a dark carpet, almost invisible. But how it popped from there, I don't know, I must have moved a polish cloth or something, and it bounced off the silicone mat and bounced between my legs and down onto the floor, and it was gone. I've had that happen so many times, even when I'm being careful. So be extra careful with these tiny little bits. So the barrel's looking very good. Still has the impression on it. In the last polishing bit with the polishing compound, I took the nib and feed out because I didn't want to get that polished gunk compound all over the nib and feed. This is the cap with 400 grit, sort of a matte finish now. Do a comparison here. You can see what the difference is. Now we'll go through and do this treatment on the cap as well and put all of its little bits together without losing them. Doug. Okay, now here's the cap, all polished up and beautiful. And I got to put the clip back together. You remember I put notches in that for my slot screwdriver. So we're going to try to put that brass piece back on to fasten the clip. I'm going to place the clip between the two breather holes. Try to get that brass part started. And I'd file down a special bit just to go into these very, very shallow slots. We'll try this. I think that did it. Yep, and I'll probably polish that top jewel up a little bit with some polishing compound. Polish it up once it's in. There you go. I use the masking tape to get that jewel down tight, and then of course it leaves the residue. It's a little bit of Ronson lighter fluid, which you can buy at 10 times the price. They call it Goo Gone or Gooby Gone. Same stuff. Still have a little bit of polish here left. Pretty good. Now we have to put the nib feed breather tube together. I've already polished up that feed so it's really nice and shiny. Just going to give it a little bit more. There we go. Very nice. And this time we'll put the breather tube in only just a bit like that. Because the taller the breather tube, the more ink you'll get. We just make sure it's firmly in there. It's sticking because of the ink. So I'm just going to use my 400 grit sandpaper just to sand that surface of the feed. It's ebonite, and that ebonite dust ends up being a nice dry lubricant. Just leave it sandy like that. And we'll try again. Well, that's much better. Feel for the path of least resistance. Give it a push. That won't go anymore. And it's lined up. And there we go. I'm just going to drop a little bit of silicone grease, silicone oil on those threads just to lubricate them nicely and stop any potential leaks. I'd rather not seal that section down, and generally with these Vacumatics, you don't. There we go. It's looking very nice. And it's fully functional too. So now that we're complete, I'm going to give this another fill of ink. And we'll come back and I'll give you my thoughts on this resurrection. So what do I think about this pen resurrection? I was going to title this one, It Was the Best of Times, It Was the Worst of Times. But I don't think I would be able to get over the collective groan that came up from all of you, so I refrained from saying it. Forget I said that. I had high hopes for this little debutante in this gorgeous golden pearl celluloid. Look at that. Just beautiful. But it's 89 years old, and you never know what's going to happen with an 89-year-old. I'm not sure whether my mentioning that it might break caused it to break or not, but certainly it wouldn't take the bending. And I felt that the tipping material might be pretty brittle. But the good news is that this pen now writes like a dream. It just, the first time, every time, and it's just as smooth as glass. So this beautiful pen hopefully will find its way into the hand of someone who will appreciate it and for whom it will fit a little bit better than it does in my hand, because it's not a large pen at all. And it has to make way for this one. This is a circa 1945 Parker Vacumatic in Azure Blue Pearl. This was the third of the set. The first one's gone. It went out as a package yesterday, and I've already had some interest in this pen even before it's been resurrected. So I'm hoping that this one won't be an issue. It seems to be a very fine nib, this one, but it's in good shape, so there's no bending needed. It might need some smoothing, I don't know. And it also is very clean and has some nice transparency. And of course, this is a regular size Vacumatic, and I'll be working on this one over the next week. So keep your eyes open for this resurrection coming up, but also remember that members get instant notification whenever these videos go public. So they get sometimes 5, 6, 7 days of advance notice that some of these pens are for sale, and that only costs you 99 cents a month to support my channel. But if you do like this video, please like and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell to get instant notifications whenever a new video is posted publicly. And that just leaves it for me to say, thank you for watching. And that's all she wrote.